want you to know that in this episode, in no way do I need you to go into any details that are unhelpful for you. And we just want to focus on what's working and what's not working about the way we as a community handle sexual harassment in Singapore. I'm going to start with this first as a way to introduce you. A challenge for many survivors is that while they want to share what they did go through, they also don't want to be defined forever by that terrible experience that happened to them. So for yourself, in one sentence, how would you like to define your own self at this beginning of the conversation?
I think this is always a funny one. A lot of this rhetoric, and maybe we'll talk about this later I'm trying to keep it to one sentence, so please consider there's no full stop here. I think it's difficult to say, am I a survivor? Am I somebody who has experienced this? But I think taking it maybe in the wider context, I think I consider myself just sort of a human who has experienced many things, including life-changing acts of violence. But maybe in my capacity today, in what I'm speaking about, as survivor / victim / advocate. But it's kind of hard in any one day, in any one moment, to say, oh, today this is how I'm going to define myself, even outside of the realms of harassment.
I'm really appreciating how even that needs to be highlighted. There's that whole dance of how do we refer to each other who have gone through this? There's a lot of you should only use this term survivor, you should only use this term. And I guess the word etiquette sounds so weird in this, but what would you say is the etiquette around how should you refer to someone?
I think number one thing is, how does that person want to be referred to? Because I think that for us as people who have experienced sexual violence and sexual trauma, or any violence or any trauma, even outside of the realms of the sexual nature of things, really there is no word that has yet been created in the English language to kind of be, I am a person who has experienced something that was not in my control, that I really didn't want to experience, and yet here we are. That's ultimately what I would like to find as a term, but that's a lot of words, and it's not really a term. So survivor is fine for me. Victim is also fine for me. In the legal context, I will use victim because that's how we're taught, and that's how the law sort of discusses the person who's sitting in the dock as the witness, as the person who's experienced that. So for me, they are, and for how, and you refer to me, it can be interchangeable, but it's ultimately according to that person who's sitting in front of you and what they are asking you to refer to them as.
Thank you for that distinction. I think for some of our listeners, it might be, why are you even making an episode about #MeToo? Isn't that over and done with? There's new things to talk about. And I'm wondering, as an advocate for that #MeToo campaign in Singapore, what's your take on that? Do you still want to talk about this as a #MeToo thing, or how would you prefer to reframe the conversation?
I think the #MeToo movement was a moment in time. It was a catalyst. It was a catalyst for the change that still needs to happen. Because just because the Me Too movement happened, it doesn't mean that society no longer has the issue of sexual violence, that nobody ever experiences sexual harassment, that etc. What it did in that moment, in that time, was to place a spotlight on the fact that it does happen, and it reignited this conversation. So it's not a defunct movement at all, but I think almost that what it did was to raise awareness, and now that we have that awareness that is raised, then my role perhaps as an advocate and in having these discussions with people is, how can we then move this conversation on to what needs to be done in the minutiae, in the day-to-day, at the grassroots, so that we can help survivors, but also to prevent this from happening in general.
Yeah. So I think for people who are trying to wrestle with this topic for the first time, and let's say they don't themselves have any lived experience with it, and they are saying, oh gosh, there's so many big and complicated words, and I don't even understand what sexual harassment means. Is that really sexual harassment? So, could you help this beginner take their first steps into this wilderness? What is sexual harassment?
Absolutely. And I completely understand this. I think I've seen this firsthand with friends and with colleagues who've never had that experience. And for me then at the time trying to speak to them about it, it became very, very difficult for both sides. People said,
Yeah.
I'm really not comfortable, etc. So I think it's very important for people like myself and for people who are more well versed in this discussion to sort of just speak up and explain, really, now that I'm in a good place to do so. So sexual harassment it's any kind of unwanted behavior of a sexual nature that makes the person experiencing that behavior feel humiliated or intimidated, or it creates a hostile environment. Ultimately, it's a form of abuse. It can take quite a lot of different forms. So it can be verbal, it can be written, it can be in the form of jokes, it can be in the form of sexual advances. There's really a very, very wide variety of how this can take place. But ultimately, what you're looking at is how the person who is experiencing that feels.
And if there's a listener out there who's saying like, well, I've had certain experiences, but I'm not sure that's harassment or not. Like, am I being too sensitive here? Am I being like too judgy? Like, how would you tell that listener to distinguish it for him or herself?
Well, ultimately, it's a question of, does this make you feel uncomfortable? And certainly, I think I experience quite regularly, actually, instances where I do feel, oh, okay, maybe this is not necessarily something I'm comfortable with. Maybe that joke was inappropriate, or maybe people shouldn't speak about me in this way or refer to me in this way. And it's a lot of the time that concern about, oh, maybe I'm feeling too sensitive, is something that we all also need to consider as, who is telling us, who in our brains, maybe, or who in society is telling us that we are too sensitive, and why. Because ultimately, if you are being made to feel uncomfortable about this or about what somebody is doing to you, there's quite a high probability that somebody else is also probably feeling uncomfortable, either in the same conversation as you're having at that moment, or would feel the same in a similar conversation had somebody said the same thing to them. So it is subjective.
Yeah.
Some people don't mind at all. Some people say, if they don't mind at all, and they kind of say, look, I love this kind of conversation, and I want people to comment on me, etc. That's not unwanted behavior.
Yeah.
But what we are talking about here in the harassment context is, it is unwanted. It does make you feel uncomfortable.
As I'm hearing you, it reminds me of how friends I've had, like, the only time it was validated for them that that it wasn't you being sensitive is when they sought therapy and they explained it, and it was useful for them to hear from a professional therapist perspective that, no, that's not you being too sensitive. That's exactly as you saw it. It's harassment.
Absolutely. And then my question is, should we need professionals to tell us this, or how can we be better people in society, or better friends, better family members, more supportive community members, so that we can be that person that somebody feels safe to say, I don't actually know how I feel about this. Look, this XYZ is what has happened and I don't feel okay. And instead of being the person who automatically is like, oh, don't, just diminishes that experience and says you're overreacting, can we sit with that person in their experience and in that moment and say, how can I support you? You're not feeling okay. I want to validate that you're not feeling okay. I believe and understand and appreciate your experience, and I want to be an empathetic person and listener and friend.
And I want to unpack that word validate for a while, because I think people may not completely understand what validation means. So before I get into like the theoretical explanation of what that is, I would love to hear from you, your experience. Like, what does validation look and feel like, and what does invalidation look and feel like?
I think validation for me is three words. I believe you. I believe you. I appreciate that this is your experience as a human on this earth. It's your views and your feelings are valid and real. They are not to be diminished. They are to be discussed, they are to be upheld, and they are to be honored in this moment. And I think that it's interesting that a lot of the time in our lives outside of the context of sexual harassment,
Yeah.
feelings are validated all of the time. If somebody is going through a loss, you don't say, "Oh, get over it." "Oh, I'm so sorry that person is no longer in your life anymore, but I don't believe that you're upset anymore, or I don't believe that you should be upset." There's plenty of examples of this outside of the context of sexual harassment. And I think that as a society, we haven't yet developed the understanding collectively that sexual harassment is something that is just as valid as going through a traumatic event of any kind, whether it be violence, whether it be loss. And where the language, I think, needs to evolve is it is a thing that happens and it is something that does deeply affect you. And here, I'm here to support you. That's where we need to go as a society in the context of sexual violence.
I love like the way you've unpacked it. I think it's practical. It gets down to it, and it really matches with what validation actually means in theory. It just means like when someone says a thing like "I'm angry" or "I'm sad," validating them just means, okay, I hear you say you're sad, or I hear you say you're angry. That is as simple as it is. It means whatever you just said, you are really saying it, instead of saying, "No, you're not angry." Yeah, so that's like classic invalidation.
Absolutely. And yeah, you think about that in the context of a child.
Yes, yes.
You cannot tell a child, "You're not angry," when they're having a tantrum. How is that going to work? And I think a lot of the therapy talk, and you'll probably hear this a lot from me in the course of this discussion, is we all have an inner child, right? And we all have
Yes,
that
yes.
kind of the child within us, which has those like the deep and profound emotions.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of this is about how can you nurture that? How can you
yeah.
nurture that inner child inside of you and the inner child inside of the person with whom you're in conversation?
Yeah, and if we circle that back to, if you are someone who went through a thing and you're not sure, am I being too sensitive here? Validating yourself simply means, well, I feel uncomfortable. I feel sensitive about it, and that's real for me, and not invalidate yourself immediately like, oh, I'm being too sensitive. Yeah, so it's a beautiful
Absolutely.
practice. Yeah. And I want to explore like other terms that come out in the sexual harassment conversation that people don't totally understand. And one of them is grooming. Some of us have heard the term grooming with regards to children, right? But few of us are aware that adults can also groom other adults. And grooming is actually a strategy that some people use to gain the trust of a target and ultimately manipulate that trust to gain some kind of advantage, whether it's monetary or sexual or whatever. So, is it possible that someone is being sexually harassed and not know because they had been groomed before?
Well, ultimately, again, it is a lot to do with how you feel as the person who's experiencing it. But harassment, I mean, in my experience, to sort of give you a little bit of an understanding around that, I wasn't aware that what was happening to me in that moment was harassment. I was probably what I would now classify as being groomed by somebody who was in a position of power over me. It started very small, and the very small, like constantly complimenting me or constantly kind of going out of their way to be really really nice to me, making space for me, kind of putting me up on a pedestal and telling me that I was fantastic first in my job, and then it sort of moved on a little bit more to kind of my appearance, and then slowly sort of breaking down the boundaries that I would have had between work and my personal life, calling me very very late at night, making me stay very very late in the office, all the weekends, can you come to my house to drop off a file, etc., sort of building those levels of there is no distinction between your
Yeah.
work and your personal life. But a lot, because it was done very slowly over the course of years, I didn't really consider it as harassment, and I wouldn't have done so at the time until the point where it tipped over into this incident, which then led me to realize that everything that had been happening before was building up to this moment, was building up to this sort of pinnacle of, now I'm going to tip over into being overtly sexual towards you. And you have to accept it because I have given you the framework within which I expect you to accept it. So I now know, looking back, that all of those behaviors were inappropriate. Did I know at the time? No. So I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that maybe you don't know, or that maybe you don't know the language around it at the time, or you didn't know. I didn't know I could have gone to the police about what happened to me. And I didn't know that until I think maybe 2 years after it had happened, because I was so afraid of it. And he told me that there was nothing wrong, and that this was all, I was so deeply in that headspace. Then that is why, to be honest, that's why I talk about this so much, is because I really want to show people that you're not crazy. You need to really trust yourself and your understanding around it, but also don't judge yourself and don't shame yourself for, in that moment, maybe not knowing how to react or what is even happening to you.
Yeah, I'm really struck and pained and angered, like when I work with supporting different sorts of people through different incidences, and there's a bit of like self-blame on like, oh, I should have known, and there's almost like guilt that like, why didn't I know? And other people can look at you and say like, yeah, you should have known, you know. And could you speak into that special struggle that victims of sexual harassment face, that there is a systemic pattern of people imagining that you should have known?
There really is. And in fact, you should have known was one of the first things people said to me when I started to report the harassment that I had faced. The partner that I had at the time, his first words out of his mouth were, "Surely you knew that this would happen." And I, at the time, was sitting on the floor in absolute tears and didn't know what to do. Yes, that's maybe quite a dramatic example, but it is nevertheless something that really happened to somebody who was a survivor, who was in that moment going through a state of extreme trauma. And it is so accepted in the context of society and in these discussions that people will just say that, and people can just say that. And again, it's that validation. Where is that validation? It doesn't matter if somebody external to that experience, who's never been through that or has never lived through that, thinks this thing. And in fact, it's almost their reaction to something that has nothing to do with the survivor and nothing to do with the person who's experiencing that trauma. It's just, oh, how can I make this go away? How can I make this crying woman stop crying and tell her that it's not as bad as she thinks? Oh, I'm going to diminish her experience. And sometimes people really do this in a way that they think is helpful. So I really can't judge people or be angry with people for doing this. All that I can do is to say, we need to have a more nuanced conversation about this, and we need a lot more empathy and a lot more understanding. So yes, it's a really, really tricky thing. And for survivors who do experience this, my heart really goes out to all of us, because it's not an easy thing to deal with. And this is why something like AWARE's first responder training, there's quite a few trainings around there that you can get across the world that will help people who want to be there for their families and who want to be there for people who are experiencing this kind of trauma, so that they can have an educated response to it.
I think I've definitely discovered that there's a lot of naiveness in our system about how skillfully someone can get someone to do something that they didn't want, and expect the victim to have known better is almost like magical thinking. But I get it. Like sometimes only if you have gone through it yourself, or you are helping others who have gone through it, can you fully appreciate that, wow, this stuff is really difficult to navigate?
It is. And I think what I've learned is less is more a lot of the time. It's okay, you're telling me that this has happened to you. I believe you. I'm just going to sit with you. What do you need? How can I help? What can I do? Is there anything that I can do in this moment to help you? Or do you just want to cry? And that's fine, because I will be here to hold you emotionally in whatever way you need,
Yeah.
but I will just sit. I think there's so much emphasis to how can we fix this problem right
Yeah.
now?
Yeah.
The situation has already happened a lot of the time. The person is already experiencing it. We can't go back in time. But what we can do is build empathy and sit with the person and say, I have resources. The internet has resources. Places like Aware and loads of other fantastic organizations in Singapore have resources.
Yeah.
That is all there for you. But in this moment, what are you feeling? How can I nourish you as a person and make you feel safe in this moment so that we can then maybe work through it together?